I used to think Silicon Valley was a place that valued people by their brain power, a place where, as long as you worked hard enough and your code was clean enough, you'd have a seat at the table, regardless of where you came from. But then everything changed in a heartbeat, and the costliest lesson I learned at 25 was that in this America, sometimes people don't buy your talent, they only buy the name printed on your university degree and your family's last name. It was 3 a.m. on a Friday. The air in the Sterling Corp server room was bone-chilling cold, but I was breaking into a cold sweat, my fingers typing incessantly on a worn-out mechanical keyboard. I had just finished the final line of code for Genesis, an artificial intelligence core capable of self-learning and predicting financial market trends with an accuracy unprecedented in history. It was the brainchild I had stayed up for 6 months to nurture, personally building every data structure, while Richard Sterling, the golden heir of the corporation and the man titled project director, only spent his time playing golf and attending cocktail parties with the elite. When the screen flashed "Deployment Successful" in green, I smiled, the radiant smile of someone from a Chicago slum holding a degree from an obscure community college who had just created something that would shake Wall Street. I naively believed that the next morning, in the board meeting with venture capitalists, Richard would pat me on the back and introduce me as the breakthrough lead engineer. But what I didn't expect was how rotten the greed and narcissism of someone born with a silver spoon could be. At 8 a.m., the glass boardroom on the 60th floor was flooded with sunlight and the scent of expensive roasted coffee. I sat humbly at the corner of the table, wearing a shirt hastily bought at a discount store, nervously watching Richard step onto the podium. He looked like a god stepping out of Forbes magazine in a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit with a smile so confident it was arrogant. And then he began the presentation with a sentence that made my heart stop. Ladies and gentlemen, after months of personally researching and designing the architecture, today I am proud to introduce to you my legacy, Genesis. He emphasized the word "my" smoothly, without a single glance toward me, completely dismissing the existence of the data assistant who had exhausted herself for this project. I was speechless, my throat tightened, feeling as if someone had just swung a sledgehammer into my chest. But the real tragedy was only beginning. Richard, with his massive but technically hollow ego, had secretly interfered with the user interface last night just to make the display look slicker for the investors, and the disaster was that he accidentally disabled a core link file. The moment he clicked the button to run a test with live data from the NASDAQ, the system stuttered. 1 second, 2 seconds, then a series of blood-red error messages flooded the large screen. The prediction charts collapsed, and the server alarm shrieked loudly. The room erupted in chaos. Million-dollar investors began to whisper, frowning in annoyance. Richard's gaze shifted from arrogance to sheer panic. He stood frozen on the podium, his hands trembling helplessly over the trackpad because he was completely clueless about what was happening beneath the interface layer. And then, in the moment every eye turned to him, waiting for an explanation, the base survival instinct of the privileged emerged. He couldn't admit fault. The Sterling family never admits fault. Slowly, Richard raised his head, his panicked eyes instantly turning cold and cruel as he pointed his finger directly at me, shivering in the corner of the room. "This is why," Richard's voice rang out, sharp and cold, cutting through the whispers. "This is why I warned HR about lowering recruitment standards. I assigned her, Eleanor Vance, the most basic data entry task to check a sub-encryption chain, and she ruined the entire security structure of the project with her ignorance." Every eye in the room immediately turned, like sharp spears piercing through me. I sat there stunned, feeling the blood in my veins run cold. "Richard, what are you saying? You know very well the algorithm core was—" I stammered, trying to stand up to defend myself, but Richard didn't let me finish. He stepped closer, leaning both hands on the table and lowering his face near mine, breathing a lethal aura of expensive perfume onto me. "That's the problem with picking a community college dropout from Southside Chicago to work with high-level software engineering," he sneered, his volume just loud enough for the most powerful people in the room to hear the blatant contempt. You were just a louse on the sole of Sterling Corp's shoe. You defiled my project. Pack your things, Eleanor. You're fired, and I will make sure no tech company in this valley dares to hire a saboteur from the bottom of society like you." The entire room was deathly silent. The HR director, sitting red across from me, only looked down, avoiding my desperate gaze. No one spoke up to defend me. In their world, the word of a sterling heir was always the truth, while the words of a girl in a cheap shirt were just meaningless barks. I bit my lip until it bled to force those tears back inside. I didn't scream, I didn't curse, because I knew that in this country where bro culture, the clique culture of privileged tech men dominated, a poor woman losing her temper would only be labeled as mentally unstable. I slowly stood up, kept my back straight, and packed my old laptop into my backpack. Before walking out the door, I removed the shiny Sterling Corp ID badge and placed it neatly on the table. I looked directly into Richard's gloating eyes without a word, but deep inside, a fire had been lit. I walked out of the glass skyscraper into the bright California sun, carrying bone-deep humiliation, but no despair. Because there was one secret that the man in the $3,000 suit didn't know. The Genesis algorithm was a masterpiece with a soul, and when I wrote the final line of code at 3 a.m., I had quietly implanted a dead man's switch, a fatal knot. If I, the sole designer, did not log in and authenticate with my personal security fingerprint within the next 72 hours, the entire algorithm would automatically disintegrate, turning into a pile of worthless, unrecoverable junk code. Richard thought he had just stolen an empire, but in reality, he had just manually triggered a time bomb placed right under his throne. And this game has only just begun.
Do you know what the worst feeling in Silicon Valley is? It's not when you write a wrong line of code that crashes the entire system. It's when you realize you've just been evaporated from this multi-billion-dollar industry by the simple snap of a golden boy's fingers. That afternoon, as I clutched a cardboard box and trudged out of Sterling Corp's revolving doors, the California sky suddenly erupted into a downpour, a bone-chilling winter rain that seemed intent on washing away my last shred of self-respect. My phone vibrated incessantly, not with check-ins from friends, but with automated emails from headhunters canceling all my upcoming interviews. Rumors travel faster than fiber optic speeds. Richard hadn't just fired me, he had blacklisted me from the entire San Francisco Bay Area. In this America, when you're branded an intellectual property saboteur by a top-tier corporation, on top of a six-figure student debt calling every month and a final eviction notice taped to your shabbily rented door, you are truly backed into a corner of death. But I had no time to cry. I ducked into a dilapidated Kinko's on the corner, draining the last few dollars from my credit card to print the entire Genesis source code in black and white. That's right, paper and ink. In a world obsessed with cloud data and encrypted drives, I chose the most ancient method because paper cannot be hacked and its trail cannot be erased by the power of the Sterling family. I clutched the thick stack of documents wrapped in thin plastic, catching the latest night bus toward Atherton, the ultra-rich enclave where tech billionaires hide behind fortified iron gates and giant cypress trees. My target was Julian Hayes, the CEO of Richard's biggest rival. Julian was a self-made legend, a genius madman who rose from nothing, but he was also known as the most ruthless, paranoid, and cold-blooded shark in the business. Rumor had it he was once stripped of his first algorithm by his own fiancée and co-founder, who sold it to a rival, leaving him nearly bankrupt and sleeping under a bridge. That wound had turned Julian into a heartless monster, a fortress that no one could penetrate. But right now, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and Julian was the only light with enough power to crush Richard Sterling. I stood, waiting in the torrential rain outside Julian's mansion for 3 grueling hours. My entire body was soaked, shivering uncontrollably, my cheap canvas shoes mired in mud, but my hands still gripped the documents against my chest as if holding my very life. Near midnight, The blinding headlights of a black bulletproof SUV cut through the rain, shining directly on me. The car screeched to a halt just a meter away. The window rolled down. For the first time, I faced Julian Hayes. He wore his signature black turtleneck, his eyes deep set, piercing and as dark as a winter lake. He stared at me, not with surprise, but with utter contempt. A recently fired Sterling Corp employee standing at my gate at midnight? Julian's voice rose, colder than the rain lashing against my face. He had evidently investigated exactly who I was as the car approached. Do you think I'm an idiot, or do you just overrate your acting skills? I took a step forward, trying to keep my voice from trembling. Mr. Hayes, I'm not a spy. I've brought you what Richard Sterling just claimed was his. This is the original, the real algorithm. He stole it from me, and— Stop! Julian interrupted harshly, stepping out of the car regardless of the rain, his tall frame radiating a suffocating pressure. He approached, staring at the Sterling ID badge I had deliberately worn to grab attention, his eyes streaked with the red veins of a lingering past resentment. In Julian's eyes right now, I wasn't a desperate girl seeking justice. I was the embodiment of deception, one of those people willing to use a pathetic appearance to steal intellectual property. Do you think this script is new? Play the victim, bring a pile of junk code for me to plug into my system, and then boom, a back door opens for the Sterlings to swallow my company whole. Julian sneered, a cruel half-smile on his lips. Did Richard Sterling send you here to use this sob story, or did you come here to sell yourself for a life-changing check because you can't pay your rent? Every word he uttered was like a cleaver hacking away at my pride. My throat felt choked. I wanted to scream at him, to slap that arrogant face, but I knew the anger of the weak is just a comedy in the eyes of the elite. Just look at it, I gritted my teeth, holding the file out with both hands, stubbornly patient. Just one page. A genius like you will know from a single line of code if it's trash or a gold mine. Julian looked at the file, then back at me. Suddenly, he reached out and snatched it. Before I could breathe a sigh of relief, a sharp rip echoed through the rain. Julian didn't even bother to open it. With the strength of his ruthless hands, he tore the thick document in half and threw it straight into the mud at my feet. Those white pages containing tens of thousands of lines of my life's work, the sleepless nights I spent enduring Richard's manipulation, now lay scattered, soaked, and stained with filth under Julian's expensive Italian leather shoes. Go home and tell your master that Julian Hayes does not collect garbage, he tossed back coldly before turning to get into his car, leaving me standing there, frozen in the pitch-black rain. The iron gates slowly opened and slammed shut, swallowing the car into the magnificent darkness of the estate. I collapsed into the mud, my freezing hands trembling as I picked up each torn fragment. Injustice, pure injustice. The thief stands on the podium of glory, while the talented are trampled like stray dogs. But what that bitter, wounded billionaire didn't realize was that as he pressed his proud heel onto those scattered papers to enter his car, a tiny torn fragment containing 3 core commands of a timeless algorithmic logic had stuck firmly to his wet soul. A tiny, sharp puzzle piece, strong enough to pierce the most arrogant fortress and completely flip this life-and-death game.
The rain continued to pour down in torrents. Have you ever knelt in a mud puddle in Atherton, the kind of place in Silicon Valley where even the lawns are laser-trimmed and the scent of money rises from every paving stone? I knelt there, my soaked clothes clinging to my body, the skin-piercing chill of Northern California seeping into my very bones. Anyone in my position at that moment would have screamed, would have cursed the damn billionaire who had just torn their last hope to shreds, or at least sobbed in sheer frustration. But not me. Tears are a luxury that kids raised on food stamps in Southside Chicago like me aren't allowed to waste. Crying doesn't pay the rent, and my breakdown would only be entertainment for those in the upper echelons of society. I leaned down, my stiff, frozen hands picking up each mud-caked scrap of paper. No rushing, no panic. I gathered them with a haunting carefulness, smoothing every crease as if I were cradling my own life. On the other side of the massive wrought iron gates, Julian Hayes hadn't quite entered his car. He stood there, one hand on the door handle, his dark gaze staring at me through the curtain of rain. I knew what he was waiting for. In his twisted and cynical world, a fraud, when exposed, would lash out, threaten lawsuits, or wail for pity. My calm silence seemed to completely disrupt the psychological algorithm he had pre-programmed to deal with people. I slowly stood upright, clutching the mangled stack of papers tight against my heaving chest. I looked directly into Julian's deep-set eyes through the downpour. In that moment, there was no pleading, no hatred, only a cold pity I felt for the man standing at the top of the world. "You know, Mr. Hayes," my voice rang out, not loud, but sharp enough to slice through the noisy rain. "They say you're the man who sees through every piece of data on Earth, but you are rich enough to own the world, yet too poor to recognize the truth when it's lying right at your feet." I didn't wait for his reaction. I turned my back and walked away, my footsteps slow and steady against the wet asphalt, without looking back once. That slap didn't require a hand, but I knew it struck his proud ego dead center. Inside the luxurious mansion, the air thickened with a suffocating tension. Julian stepped through the solid oak doors, irritably tossing his soaked coat onto an expensive leather sofa. His face was tense, his jaw clenched from an indescribable restlessness, a faint discomfort prodding at a conscience he thought had died long ago. "What on earth were you doing out there, Julian?" A deep, commanding voice echoed from a dark corner of the living room. It was Martha. If there was anyone in this arrogant Silicon Valley powerful enough to look this billionaire in the eye and scold him, it was her. Martha wasn't a housekeeper or a nanny. She was the senior legal counsel, the African-American godmother who had protected Julian since he was a penniless student, eating canned food and coding in her dilapidated garage. She had witnessed how he shattered when his fiancée betrayed him, stealing his copyrights to sell to a rival, and she was the only one who saw the rot slowly eating his soul. "She's a sterling plant, Martha, just a cheap act," Julian snapped, walking quickly to the bar to pour a bourbon neat, his hand trembling slightly. Martha stepped out of the shadows, approaching the floor-to-ceiling glass window where my small silhouette was still fading into the storm. "An act? Use that genius head of yours to analyze it. What does a fraud do when they're caught? They curse and bolt to find another prey. They don't kneel in 39-degree rain to pick up scraps of paper with the face of someone who just lost a loved one. That girl wasn't picking up trash. She was picking up her dignity." She turned back, her gaze as sharp as a dagger pinned to her foster son. "You are punishing every woman in this world for the mistake of one woman from your past. You pride yourself on building a tech empire, but you've let your trauma turn you into nothing more than a cold-blooded bastard." Julian froze, the glass in his hand suspended in midair. Martha's words were like a bucket of cold water to the face, stripping away the pathetic reality he always hid behind his shell of power. He slowly lowered his head, looking down at the floor, and at that exact moment, his eyes locked onto his soaked, handcrafted leather shoe. There, stuck to the rubber sole, was a torn fragment about half the size of a palm that he had accidentally stepped on earlier. The code characters printed on it, though blurred by rain, struck the vision of a programming genius. A layered code, a structural logic completely impossible for the hollow head of Richard Sterling. Julian's heart rate suddenly spiked, a bolt of electricity shooting up his spine. At the same time, across the city, I was sitting shivering in a rickety 24/7 Waffle House, smelling of grease and burnt coffee. The middle-aged waitress looked at me with concern, quietly placing an extra cup of hot water on the table without charging me. I dried my matted hair, opened my backpack, and pulled out my old laptop with its peeling paint. Did everyone think I had lost everything? Think I would crumble and give up? No. When you've hit the bottom, the only thing you can do is look up. I plugged it in, the screen glowing bright and reflecting in my dry, steady eyes. I typed a complex string of commands into a hidden cloud server system I had encrypted myself. Everything was still there, perfect and sharp as an invisible blade. A faint, cold smile appeared on my lips. Richard Sterling, Julian Hayes, do you think this world runs on the rules of those with money? Just you wait. The time bomb in the core of Genesis is ticking down, and I am the only one who holds the key to detonate or deactivate it. My composure wasn't submission, it was preparation for a real storm that is about to sweep this arrogant valley.
Do you know the feeling when a tower of belief you've built for years suddenly collapses because of a scrap of paper no bigger than your palm? That night, in the stifling silence of his Atherton mega mansion, Julian Hayes experienced that exact sickening sensation. The blade of arrogance that once helped him cut away all pity was now carving into his own throat. Julian sat slumped in an Italian leather armchair, his expensive bourbon glass empty, but the alcohol couldn't soothe the shock radiating from his head to his heels. He held the soaked, filthy fragment he had just peeled from his soul, bringing it close to the crystal lamp. Under the dim yellow light, the ink-blurred lines of code began to clear. Julian had been a genius programmer before becoming a ruthless billionaire, and with just one glance at the 3 lines of nested logic on that scrap, his heart felt as if it were being squeezed by a vice. This wasn't some patched-together, copied, or amateurish code. This was a language of programming that bordered on art, a data architecture so sharp, lean, and dangerous that a hollow socialite like Richard Sterling couldn't have written it in 100 lifetimes. Richard didn't create Genesis. He was just a thief. And the small girl with the cheap, mud-soaked canvas shoes, she was the true brain of the new AI era. Like a madman awakened from a nightmare, Julian bolted upright and lunged for the front door, ignoring Martha's calls behind him. He charged out into the pouring rain, brushing aside 2 hulking bodyguards who tried to open umbrellas for him. The cold billionaire, described by Forbes as the man who never bows to anyone, was now kneeling on the freezing asphalt in front of his own gate, his bare hands clawing through mud puddles and grass just to salvage the crumpled papers he had torn apart hours earlier. He gathered them like gathering the broken shards of his own soul. Back inside his multi-million-dollar kitchen, Julian spread a pristine white towel over the solid marble countertop, turned a hairdryer to its lowest setting, and meticulously dried each tattered piece of paper smelling of damp earth. He used clear tape, painstakingly piecing the fragments back together. 3 a.m., the full picture of Genesis emerged. As he deciphered the entire core algorithm, cold sweat broke out on Julian's forehead. It was too perfect. It could self-predict, self-correct, and... Wait. Julian's pupils dilated. At the end of the security file, there was a hidden string of characters written as a dead man's switch, a sophisticated trap. If its creator did not authenticate, the algorithm would eat itself alive, triggering the collapse of the entire server system running it. Eleanor Vance hadn't just created a masterpiece, she had planted a nuclear bomb right under the Sterling family seat. And he, Julian Hayes, had just called her trash. He remembered her eyes under the rain. No begging, no hatred, only a calm pity for him. You are rich, but too poor to recognize the truth. Those words now echoed in his mind like a sledgehammer. He had let the trauma from a betraying woman in his past turn him into a bastard, blindly and cruelly snatching away the last life jacket of a genius who had been pushed to the edge. A surge of bitter regret rose in his throat. He hadn't just lost a trillion-dollar business opportunity, he had personally strangled his own conscience. "I have to find her," Julian muttered, his voice hoarse, grabbing the keys to his black G-Wagon. He made an urgent call to his cybersecurity team, and only 15 minutes later, Eleanor Vance's information was on his car's screen. She lived in East Palo Alto, a working-class neighborhood just a highway away from glamorous Atherton, but as distant as 2 different worlds, a place where people struggle paycheck to paycheck. 4:30 a.m. Julian's armored SUV screeched to a halt in front of a dilapidated apartment complex with peeling brick walls and the stench of cheap bleach.
He raced up the rusted iron stairs to apartment 4B. The door wasn't locked, it was slightly ajar. Julian pushed it open. Empty. No sign of the girl. The cramped room of less than 20 square meters held only an old mattress without sheets and a few empty cardboard boxes. "You looking for Ellie? You late, pal," in the expensive suit. A raspy voice, thick with cigarette smoke, came from behind. Julian turned to face an old landlord in a tattered tank top, clutching a jingling ring of keys. He was a typical working-class American with a gruff but blunt gaze. "Do you know where she went? I need to see her urgently. It's a matter of life and death." Julian stepped forward, hurriedly pulling out his wallet to grab a stack of dollars, the upper-class habit of solving everything with money. But the old man swatted his hand away, letting out a mocking sneer. "Put your money away, you Tech Valley prick. You think money buys everything? The girl was kicked out tonight because your damn Sterling company just fired her without paying her last month's salary, leaving her in credit card debt." The old man spat on the hallway floor. "But let me tell you, Ellie was the decentest kid in this slum. She ate ramen for 6 months straight, but never owed me a dime of rent until today, and she even fixed the Wi-Fi for this whole building for free. When she grabbed her backpack and walked out into the rain, she didn't cry a single tear. She told me, 'Mr. Hank, you take care of yourself. I'll be back to buy this whole building.'" The landlord jerked his chin toward a wall in the empty room. "She's gone, took everything, only left that." Julian bypassed the old man and stepped fully into the room. On the stained wall, a tiny whiteboard had been left behind. It had been wiped clean, but in the bottom right corner, a line was written neatly in red marker, the handwriting small but sharp like a declaration of war. "Genesis equals null, system.exit.1. Julian's heart felt like it was in free fall into a bottomless pit. That basic command meant absolute destruction. She hadn't run away. She had vanished into the shadows to manually press the detonate button. The cold draft from a broken window made the billionaire shiver. For the first time in his life, Julian Hayes, the man with billions of dollars and the power of life and death in the market, felt completely helpless. He had personally pushed the greatest mind of this generation into the dark, turning a resilient girl into an enemy with nothing left to lose. A surge of bitter regret rose in his throat. He hadn't just lost a trillion-dollar business opportunity, he had personally strangled his own conscience. "I have to find her," Julian muttered, his voice hoarse, grabbing the keys to his black G-Wagon. He made an urgent call to his cybersecurity team, and only 15 minutes later, Eleanor Vance's information was on his car's screen. She lived in East Palo Alto, a working-class neighborhood just a highway away from glamorous Atherton, but as distant as two different worlds, a place where people struggle paycheck to paycheck.
In Silicon Valley, people often whisper a joke that is actually a profound truth. If you don't exist on Google, you're dead. Julian Hayes owned a data empire that could dig up a medical record from halfway across the world in 5 seconds, but it had taken him 36 frantic hours and the mobilization of the most notorious private investigators in the underworld to find a trace of Eleanor Vance. She hadn't fled the country, she had simply erased her digital footprint, tossed her smartphone into the San Francisco Bay, and returned to the real world. A world without free Wi-Fi and $6 lattes. It was a humble roadside spot called Loretta's Diner, perched precariously by the highway on the edge of Oakland's industrial zone. The place reeked of heavy truck exhaust, charred bacon, and the crackle of country music coming from an 80s jukebox. When Julian's glossy black G-Wagon screeched into the gravel lot, it looked out of place and ridiculous amidst a forest of rusty work trucks. Julian stepped out, throwing on an expensive overcoat, and pushed through the grease-stained glass door. The chaotic noise of the diner shattered against his ears, and then he saw her. Ellie wasn't wearing a cheap office shirt or the soaked, pathetic look from that rainy night. She was in a mustard yellow uniform with frayed edges, her hair neatly bunned with a chipped plastic clip, one hand balancing a tray of syrup-drenched pancakes while the other expertly poured black coffee for two burly construction workers who were laughing loudly. Julian's heart skipped a beat.
A genius mind who had just created a new AI era, someone holding an algorithm that could be valued at billions, was now smiling as she accepted a crumpled $1 tip and wiped down a sticky table. Guilt felt like an invisible hand strangling his throat. He stepped forward, quietly sitting at an empty table in the furthest corner, the torn vinyl seat creaking under the billionaire's weight. Ellie recognized him instantly. The hands holding the coffee pot didn't flinch, and her gaze didn't waver. She walked to his table, pulled a small order pad from her apron pocket, and spoke in a flat, soulless voice as if addressing any long-haul trucker. "Black coffee or over-easy eggs, sir?" Her composure made Julian feel breathless. He swallowed hard, his usual arrogance completely gone. "Ellie, I came to apologize," he began, his voice hoarse, his volume nearly swallowed by the loud hum of the kitchen's exhaust fan. "I read what you left behind. I personally pieced every scrap of paper back together. I was a bastard, blind and arrogant. Richard stole your work, and I trampled over your chance for justice. I know an apology is meaningless now, so I brought this." Julian reached into his inner coat pocket, pulled out a crocodile skin checkbook, scribbled a powerful signature, and slid a blank check across the syrup-stained table. Along with it was a pre-printed contract. "This is a contract for the position of Chief Technology Officer at my corporation. You fill in the salary, stock options, private jet privileges, anything you want. And this check is my personal compensation for that night in the rain. Take it, leave this wretched place, and let me help you take Genesis back from the Sterlings. I swear I'll make Richard pay." Julian looked at her, his eyes filled with intense sincerity mixed with the hope for forgiveness. In his world, nobody turned down a blank check from Julian Hayes. It was a golden ticket to the top. But Ellie only quietly looked at the check, then at the contract. She didn't even blink. The atmosphere was so still, Julian could hear the blood thumping in his eardrums. Slowly, Ellie grabbed the dirty rag hanging from her hip and wiped a hard line across the table, grazing the edge of the $1 million check and leaving a yellow grease stain on it. "Mr. Hayes," Ellie said, her lips curling into a sharp half-smile, "you still haven't learned a thing, have you? You still think this world runs on pity and the charity checks of your elite class." She picked up the check without a hint of respect and gently tore it in half before Julian's stunned eyes, letting the pieces flutter to the floor exactly like he had done to her files. "I don't sell my humiliation for money, and I certainly don't work for someone who trampled on my dignity." Julian was speechless. He had never been rejected so bluntly. "But you need my resources to fight Richard." He tried to salvage the situation, his tone shifting from pleading to harsh reality. "On your own, with a locked algorithm, you can't sue the Sterling family. Their lawyers will crush you before you even file a claim." Suddenly, a rough hand slammed a plate of lemon pie right in front of Julian. It was Loretta, the large black woman with tight curls who owned the diner. She planted her plump hands on her hips, glaring at the billionaire in his designer clothes. "Listen here, suit boy. This girl Ellie fixed my entire 10-year-old broken register system in 15 minutes. She doesn't need your pity. In this America, working folks like us might be poor in money, but nobody's poor in self-respect. Eat your pie or get out from my table so she can clean it for another customer." Loretta's appearance was like a waking slap, reminding Julian that Ellie wasn't alone. She had the protection of real people and real values that he had long since lost. Ellie gave a small smile to the owner, then turned back to look directly into Julian's wavering eyes. She leaned both hands on the table, bringing her face close to his, creating an invisible pressure that made the self-made billionaire subconsciously lean back. "I don't need you to help me take back Genesis, because Genesis is mine, and the detonation command is in my head." Ellie's voice dropped, cold and decisive like a queen commanding a subject. "I don't need a job. What I need is an empire of my own. You want Genesis? Fine, but we do it by my rules. Throw away your ridiculous employment contract. I don't work for you, I work with you. I want 50% of the subsidiary developing this project, the title of Chief Technology Officer at your corporation, and absolute control over the algorithm. If you nod, we shake hands and crush Richard Sterling. If you shake your head, Ellie shrugged, removing her cheap hair clip and letting her hair fly back proudly. I'll take that code to some leaky garage, crowdfund it, and personally build something that will turn both your company and Richard's into ashes within the next 3 years. Your choice. Julian Hayes was stunned. The cold, resilient, and ambitious gaze of the girl standing before him made him shiver, but immediately after, a strange satisfaction surged through his veins. He saw in her the image of himself many years ago, a man with nothing, fearless, ready to burn the world to protect his creation. This slap in the face didn't make him angry. It awakened a deep, absolute respect within his damaged narcissism. Julian let out a genuine smile for the first time in years and slowly reached out his hand, not with a check, but for a handshake between equal partners. A life and death alliance was officially formed amidst the grease and dust of the impoverished slum, preparing to drop a bomb on America's most arrogant elite.
The handshake in that grease-scented Oakland diner marked the most unlikely, yet most insane alliance in the history of Silicon Valley. Julian Hayes didn't take me back to his glamorous glass skyscraper in downtown San Francisco. Instead, the G-Wagon drove us to a dilapidated old red brick warehouse tucked away in the Dog Patch, a former industrial dockland that had long been abandoned. Stepping inside, the smell of mildew hit my nose, but behind dust-covered plastic sheets lay a field of cutting-edge servers, liquid cooling systems humming quietly, and massive curved monitor arrays. Welcome to where I started everything, before the men in expensive suits turned me into a cold-blooded money-printing machine, Julian said, tossing me a bundle of keys and a military-grade encrypted access card. In this valley, people love to brag about offices with ping-pong tables and free craft beer, but the ones who truly change the world are rooted in the darkest corners, fueled by empty Red Bull cans and sunken eyes. And so, I began my war. For 48 consecutive hours, I was glued to the screens, coding like a machine possessed. I needed to rebuild the entire shell for the Genesis core from memory, creating a second firewall so that when the 72-hour deadline hit, the Sterling family's bomb would detonate without affecting the source code in my hands. Julian didn't say much. He canceled every trillion-dollar meeting, pulled up a worn-out chair 3 meters away from me, and watched in silence. In the eyes of this billionaire who once hated the world for its betrayals, I saw astonishment slowly shifting into profound respect. One night, as I strained to untangle a complex logic error, Julian slid a steaming espresso next to my keyboard. He stared at the lines of code scrolling down the black screen, his voice dropping low. "You don't write code like any Ivy League engineer I've ever hired. Your structure is too tight, not a single wasted byte of data. It's like you're fighting for survival on every line of command." I paused, pressing the hot cup against my freezing cheeks, and let out a faint, dry laugh. "You know, Julian, those Stanford or MIT students learn to program on cloud systems with infinite resources. They write bloated code because they never have to worry about running out of space. But me? My dad was a plumber. When I was 12, he salvaged a Raspberry Pi with a fried IC from an industrial dump and fixed it for me. That machine had exactly 512 megabytes of RAM and crashed if it was overloaded. I taught myself to code on that piece of junk." I turned to look him directly in the eye, my voice light but heavy with the weight of the past. "When you're poor, you don't have the luxury of making mistakes. Poverty and scarcity teach you how to optimize everything, from your meals to every bit of memory. I don't write code to show off. I write code to survive." Julian stood frozen, his throat moving with difficulty. That small story had completely demolished the final wall of prejudice within him. He realized that behind the community college dropout label the elite despised was a rigorous discipline, a sharp will forged at the bottom of society that money could never buy. While a masterpiece was being reborn in this tattered warehouse, 60 miles away at the magnificent glass headquarters of Sterling Corp, a nightmare was swallowing Richard whole. The 72-hour dead man switch deadline was bleeding dry, and the Genesis system began to exhibit insane AI hallucinations. The algorithm core, missing my fingerprint authentication code, had started a severe memory leak. On the large screens of the operations room, instead of predicting tech stock charts, Genesis was frantically outputting strings of meaningless data, even suggesting shorting the entire market based on Martha Stewart's apple pie recipe it had scraped from the web. Venture capitalists began to smell the smoke. Phones rang incessantly. Sterling Corp stock showed signs of a flash sell-off on the exchange. Richard was in utter panic, his expensive suit rumpled, sweat drenching his forehead. He screamed, smashing a $1,000 tablet against the wall like a child stripped of his toy. He summoned his entire team of senior engineers, men with PhDs from prestigious universities, forcing them to patch the error. But when they opened the source code, they all stood paralyzed. My code structure was a multi-dimensional Rubik's Cube encrypted with personal logic, and without the key, any interference only accelerated its self-destruction. An MIT grad lead engineer wiped away beads of sweat, reporting tremulously, "Boss, this thing is like a black box. We can't recompile it. If we force it to run, the company's entire data server will collapse. The only person who understands this architecture is Ms. Vance." The name Eleanor Vance echoed in the boardroom, turning Richard's face from flushed red to ghostly white. The peak arrogance of a narcissist was dealt a fatal blow. He had just fired the only person who could save his family's empire, and had cursed her to never rise again. Humiliation mixed with rage drove him out of his mind. "Find her. Flip this entire San Francisco Bay Area upside down for me. Use any means. Money, threats, kidnapping, anything. Bring that bitch back here," he roared, his eyes bloodshot. He resorted to illegal corporate spy tools to scan mobile signals and transaction histories to track me down. But Richard didn't know that this America always has silent heroes hiding in the most unexpected places. Back at Julian's warehouse, it was 5 a.m. My computer screen suddenly flickered, and a hidden terminal window appeared with a faint green text. It wasn't a virus, but a PGP encrypted message. I browsed, typing the decryption command. The words appeared. "The Golden Boy is drowning. He's tagged your old network signal and knows you're in the same area as Hayes. The Sterling family lawyers are drafting an intellectual property theft lawsuit against you and are preparing to slap an arrest warrant in your face. Brace yourself, little girl. Dave." My heart skipped a beat. Dave? Balding 50-year-old Dave from the IT help desk at Sterling Corp? The man who quietly pushed a cart to change printer ink and was treated like a ghost by young bosses like Richard? As it turned out, he loathed Richard's arrogance, and during the months I worked there, I was the only one who helped him sort recycling and bought him decent cups of coffee. This small but lethal countermove from an outsider gave me an absolute advantage: time. I knew the enemy was coming, and they were bringing the dirtiest weapon of the elite, the law and slander. Julian stepped up behind me, reading the message. His jaw tightened, the instinct of an alpha wolf being challenged. He reached for his phone to call his legal team, but I reached out to stop him. I turned my chair, looking at Julian, the corners of my lips curling into a radiant yet bone-chilling smile. "Don't call the lawyers, Julian," I said, my eyes glowing with the fire of freedom and true power. "Let him sue. If he wants to play the game of media manipulation, we'll give him the biggest stage in America. Get me a beautiful suit, partner. It's time we attend a tech conference." Fear had completely vanished from my mind, replaced by a shivering sense of satisfaction. Richard Sterling was swinging a knife to kill me, but I didn't know that I had a sword ready to cut his hands off completely. This alliance wasn't just for survival. It was to clean out the trash of Silicon Valley.
In this America, people often whisper a saying, "Justice is blind, but she will certainly check your bank account before delivering a verdict." Especially here in Silicon Valley, when golden boys can't beat you with brain power, they will bury you under a mountain of legal paperwork and smear campaigns. We had only 24 hours left until the Global Tech Summit in San Francisco, an event often called the Super Bowl of the startup world, where Richard Sterling intended to officially launch Genesis before thousands of media lenses and the world's most powerful billionaires. At that moment, Julian and I were sitting in the dog patch warehouse, sipping cold coffee and running tests on the final firewall layer. Suddenly, Julian's phone lit up with a barrage of urgent notifications. He frowned, opened a top tech news app, and his face darkened like an approaching storm. Without a word, he quietly turned his tablet screen toward me. The headlines struck my eyes, massive and blood red. From Dropout to Tech Spy, Julian Hayes' new protege and the century's theft at Sterling Corp. Accompanying it was a paparazzi photo of me stepping into Julian's G-Wagon outside the Waffle House the other day. Under the pens of PR mercenaries that Richard had spent millions to bribe, the story was molded into something so disgusting and perfect it made me nauseous. They didn't mention that I was the one who wrote Genesis. They painted me as a honey trap, a cunning, promiscuous woman from the slums who used her looks to seduce Richard Sterling, pry out the core secrets of Genesis, and after being caught and fired, offered that intellectual property to Julian Hayes in exchange for a softer bed and half of his empire. That's how this world works, you understand. In the rotten bro culture of powerful men here, people find it easier to believe a community college girl slept her way to the top than to believe she has a mind greater than the entire Ivy League combined. A loud thud on the table cut through my thoughts. Julian had hurled his ceramic mug against the wall, shattering it into pieces. His jaw was tight, the veins in his neck bulging. His anger wasn't because his name was dragged into a scandal, but because of the echoes of his past. "These bastards are repeating exactly what they did to me 10 years ago," Julian roared, his voice thick with ultimate bitterness and the fury of a beast backed into a corner. The past of being betrayed by the woman he loved, having his intellect stolen, and being slandered in the media was surging back to tear at him. Looking at Julian then, I thought he might turn and doubt me, asking if I really had stolen something. But no, he stepped quickly toward me, his large hands on my shoulders, his eyes burning but steady. "Ellie, listen to me. I'm calling the best lawyers on the West Coast. I'll buy that damn newspaper and fire the editor-in-chief. I will shut this down. You don't need to be afraid." In that moment, a warm stream flowed through my scarred heart. In a country where betrayal is as cheap as dirt, having a deeply wounded man stand up to take the blow for you, trusting you unconditionally without needing a single word of explanation, is worth more than $1 billion. But the trouble didn't stop there. Half an hour later, a loud pounding echoed on the iron door. Two men in cold gray suits walked in, identifying themselves as process servers. They tossed a thick stack of documents onto my table, a travel ban, an emergency asset freeze, and an 80-page lawsuit from Sterling Corp's legal team, accusing me of stealing trade secrets, violating a non-disclosure agreement, and demanding $500 million in damages. If I lost, I wouldn't just lose everything, I would face 20 years in federal prison for corporate espionage. The air in the warehouse grew thick, suffocatingly tense. Julian frantically ran his hair through his hair, shouting over the phone to his legal partners. And just as the tension reached its peak, the cheap flip phone I had bought yesterday vibrated. An unknown number, but instinct told me it was him. I signaled Julian to be quiet and turned on the speakerphone. "Good morning, Eleanor," the smooth, arrogant, and satisfied voice of Richard Sterling echoed from the other end. He was calling from a burner phone to avoid being recorded as evidence. "Do you like the gift in the news? I heard your dirty dress is about to be replaced by a federal prison orange jumpsuit." I didn't answer, just took a deep breath. He continued with his familiar gaslighting, the same trick that once made me so insecure I felt suicidal during my 6 months working for him. "Listen, Ellie, I'm a generous man. You're just a pawn being used by Julian Hayes. Do you think he truly values you? He just wants to use you to bring me down. Leave him. This afternoon, come to my lawyer's office yourself, sign a confession that Julian Hayes instigated you to steal my source code. If you play the scapegoat nicely, I'll drop the lawsuit and give you a check for $500,000, enough for you to buy a cattle ranch in Texas and live the anonymous life you belong to. Otherwise, you'll rot in prison. Make your choice, little mouse." A silence enveloped the warehouse.
Julian clenched his fists, his eyes streaked with red, waiting to grab the phone and curse the man. But I shook my head slightly, placing my hand on his to calm him. Suddenly, I laughed, a clear, sharp, ringing laugh that echoed through the tense air. My laughter stunned both Julian and Richard on the other end. "Richard," I said, my voice so calm and soft it was terrifying, as if I were speaking to a slow child. "Do you have a habit of carefully reading what your lawyers draft, or do you only know how to close your eyes and sign like a useless socialite?" The other end went dead silent. I could feel his breathing falter as his ego was insulted. "Let me explain a bit of American federal law to you." I ran my fingers lightly over the thick lawsuit file. "By suing me for intellectual property theft and filing this in court, you have officially sworn under a legal affidavit that you, Richard Sterling, are the lawful and sole author of the entire Genesis core algorithm. You have claimed it completely in the eyes of the law." Richard growled into the phone. "Of course it's mine. What the hell are you babbling about, you bitch?" The corners of my lips curled with a radiant, lethal smile. What this narcissistic fool didn't realize is that in America, if you raise capital from the public and venture capital funds based on a tech product, and that product is a hoax leading to a system collapse, the SEC will charge you with wire fraud, a crime that no billionaire can buy their way out of. "Nothing," I said, my voice cold as ice, my heart beating with the joyous rhythm of a hunter who had lured the prey into the cage. "I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for voluntarily accepting 100% of the legal liability for a time bomb that's about to explode. Stay healthy, Richard. Tomorrow at the Global Tech Summit, I have a little surprise prepared for your presentation. Don't cry." I hung up abruptly, tossing the phone on the table. Julian looked at me, his eyes wide in shock, then his mouth slowly curled into a dangerous, beaming smile. He understood the endgame. The media humiliation, the lawsuit, the threats, all those dirty accusations were not the nails in my coffin, but the noose Richard had tied around his own neck. I turned to look at the shark navy blue tailored suit that Martha had sent over yesterday, hanging neatly in the corner. It was time to shed the identity of the little mouse in the mud. Tomorrow, I would step onto their most glamorous stage, and with my own hands, I would pull down this entire arrogant sky.
If you've never set foot in the Moscone Center in San Francisco on the opening day of the Global Tech Summit, imagine it as the Super Bowl for the tech elite. The air is thick with the scent of expensive Tom Ford perfume. The light from thousands of LEDs reflects off magnificent stages, and below the stands are over 5,000 venture capitalists, powerful CEOs, and dozens of live cameras, all ready to value or bury a company in the blink of an eye. As Julian and I passed through VIP security, I was wearing a sharp navy blue suit, my hair pulled back neatly, clutching my scratched-up old laptop, the sole weapon of someone once discarded at the bottom of society. Julian walked right beside me with the pride of an alpha wolf, unfazed by the dozens of whispering eyes following us because of the smear piece on this morning's front page. We quietly moved to the front row, where gold-plated name cards were set. On the glory of the spotlight-lit stage at that moment was Richard Sterling. He looked like a demigod of Silicon Valley, wearing the signature black turtleneck and a custom-designed blazer, pacing confidently and gesturing in the air with that brainwashing presentation style tech bros always use. Behind him, a giant screen flashed the glowing Genesis logo. He was speaking loudly about the future of finance, about how his algorithm would change Wall Street forever. I sat there with my arms crossed, my heartbeat slow and cold. I looked down at the countdown timer on my phone, 71 hours and 58 minutes. Only 2 minutes remained before the dead man switch in the Genesis core would automatically trigger without my fingerprint. And the narcissistic fool on that stage had no idea he was holding a grenade with the pin already pulled. And now, ladies and gentlemen,
Richard raised his voice, flashing an arrogant smile that captivated countless camera lenses. "Instead of empty theories, I will run a live test of Genesis on real-time NASDAQ exchange data. No simulations, only the perfection of the artificial intelligence designed by my own hand." He turned and pressed a button on a tiny remote. The entire hall held its breath. The massive screen switched to a dark data analysis interface with lines of code beginning to run smoothly. The crowd gasped in awe at the system's terrifying processing speed. Richard looked down at the stands with satisfaction, and his eyes met mine. He flinched for a split second, a flash of utter panic crossing his eyes when he saw me smiling at him from the front row instead of crying in a police station as he had planned. But it was too late for him to stop. 72 hours. The trigger engaged. On the giant screen, the smooth flow of data abruptly stuttered. A piercing beep echoed from the surround sound system. The S&P 500 prediction chart, which had been soaring, suddenly snapped and plummeted with an infinite negative slope. Numbers began to dance wildly, turning into unreadable junk characters. The servers on stage began to howl as cooling fans roared under the overload. "Core memory fragmentation error, system collapse imminent," a cold AI voice warned. The hall of 5,000 people began to stir with murmurs, frowns, and dissatisfied whispers. Sterling Corp stock, which was being traded live at that moment, began to show blood-red candles signaling a sell-off. Richard's face turned ghostly pale. He broke into a heavy sweat, frantically turning back to type on the control laptop, muttering curses under his breath. But the more he typed, the more the red error messages multiplied like a virus, swallowing the entire screen. He was helpless, his hands trembling, the image of the tech demigod collapsing pathetically in just 10 short seconds. At that exact moment, I stood up. Julian immediately followed, raising a hand as a signal. Suddenly, the entire giant LED screen behind Richard disconnected from his computer, and in its place was the signal directly from my old laptop. How did I do it? In America, never underestimate the silent workers. Uncle Dave, the IT help desk guy Richard cursed every day, was the one sitting in the AV booth of the convention center. He had swapped the HDMI ports the moment I stood up, a perfect countermove from an outsider who was completely fed up with the rot of the ruling class. "What the hell is this? Security, get her out of here. She's a hacker. She's sabotaging my presentation," Richard screamed, his voice cracking, pointing at me as my computer interface appeared on the big screen. 4 hulking security guards immediately lunged toward me. But Julian Hayes stepped forward, reaching into his vest to pull out a red-stamped SEC certification and throw it straight onto the floor in front of the guards. I, Julian Hayes, just completed the acquisition of 15% of the Sterling Corp's free float shares at the opening bell this morning. As the second largest shareholder of this corporation, I demand my lead engineer resolve the mess your incompetent CEO just caused. Anyone who touches her receives their termination notice tomorrow. Julian's voice boomed like thunder, powerful and indisputable. The guards froze and stepped aside. The entire hall went dead silent, thousands of investors staring at the movie-like drama unfolding before their eyes. I didn't bother to look at Richard once. I stepped out of the row, resting my laptop on the railing separating the stands. I looked straight up at the large LED screen glowing with lethal error codes, my hands typing rapidly on the keyboard. Click, click, enter. Just 3 override commands accompanied by a fingerprint key encrypted with my personal quantum algorithm. Instantly, the alarms fell silent. The lethal red on the screen was wiped clean like a miracle, replaced by a soothing blue. The data streams returned to their proper orbit, smoother and more perfect than ever. The silence in the hall now was the silence of utter amazement. Thousands of America's finest minds had just witnessed an anonymous girl save a multi-billion-dollar system with just a few gentle keystrokes. I raised my head, resting my laptop on the railing separating the stands. I looked straight up at the large LED screen glowing with lethal error codes, my hands typing rapidly on the keyboard. Click, click, enter.
Just 3 override commands accompanied by a fingerprint key encrypted with my personal quantum algorithm. Instantly, the alarms fell silent. The lethal red on the screen was wiped clean like a miracle, replaced by a soothing blue. The data streams returned to their proper orbit, smoother and more perfect than ever. The silence in the hall now was the silence of utter amazement. Thousands of America's finest minds had just witnessed an anonymous girl save a multi-billion-dollar system with just a few gentle keystrokes. I raised my head, resting my laptop on the railing separating the stands. I looked straight up at the large LED screen glowing with lethal error codes, my hands typing rapidly on the keyboard. Click, click, enter. Just 3 override commands accompanied by a fingerprint key encrypted with my personal quantum algorithm. Instantly, the alarms fell silent. The lethal red on the screen was wiped clean like a miracle, replaced by a soothing blue. The data streams returned to their proper orbit, smoother and more perfect than ever. The silence in the hall now was the silence of utter amazement. Thousands of America's finest minds had just witnessed an anonymous girl save a multi-billion-dollar system with just a few gentle keystrokes. I raised my head, resting my laptop on the railing separating the stands. I looked straight up at the large LED screen glowing with lethal error codes, my hands typing rapidly on the keyboard. Click, click, enter. Just 3 override commands accompanied by a fingerprint key encrypted with my personal quantum algorithm. Instantly, the alarms fell silent. The lethal red on the screen was wiped clean like a miracle, replaced by a soothing blue. The data streams returned to their proper orbit, smoother and more perfect than ever. The silence in the hall now was the silence of utter amazement. Thousands of America's finest minds had just witnessed an anonymous girl save a multi-billion-dollar system with just a few gentle keystrokes. I raised my head, resting my laptop on the railing separating the stands. I looked straight up at the large LED screen glowing with lethal error codes, my hands typing rapidly on the keyboard. Click, click, enter. Just 3 override commands accompanied by a fingerprint key encrypted with my personal quantum algorithm. Instantly, the alarms fell silent. The lethal red on the screen was wiped clean like a miracle, replaced by a soothing blue. The data streams returned to their proper orbit, smoother and more perfect than ever. The silence in the hall now was the silence of utter amazement. Thousands of America's finest minds had just witnessed an anonymous girl save a multi-billion-dollar system with just a few gentle keystrokes. I raised my head, resting my laptop on the railing separating the stands. I looked straight up at the large LED screen glowing with lethal error codes, my hands typing rapidly on the keyboard. Click, click, enter. Just 3 override commands accompanied by a fingerprint key encrypted with my personal quantum algorithm. Instantly, the alarms fell silent. The lethal red on the screen was wiped clean like a miracle, replaced by a soothing blue. The data streams returned to their proper orbit, smoother and more perfect than ever. The silence in the hall now was the silence of utter amazement. Thousands of America's finest minds had just witnessed an anonymous girl save a multi-billion-dollar system with just a few gentle keystrokes. I raised my head, resting my laptop on the railing separating the stands. I looked straight up at the...
Retribution in Silicon Valley often arrives fast, sometimes faster than the fiber optic trading speeds of Wall Street. Immediately after the LED screens at the Moscone Center displayed the tribute to the Southside Chicago plumber, Sterling Corp's stock evaporated 30% of its value in less than 50 minutes, before the New York Stock Exchange was forced to hit the circuit breaker to halt trading. But that was only the beginning of a legal nightmare. In America, you can be a terrible person. You can cheat on your wife or stab your friends in the back, but there is one power that even the oldest financial dynasties never want to cross: the Securities and Exchange Commission. The next morning, before Richard Sterling could even sober up from his sorrow-drowning binge, a team of federal agents in windbreakers with blue crosses knocked on the door of his $1 million penthouse. They carried search warrants and subpoenas for investor fraud.
The most ironic part, and the most bitter for a narcissist like Richard, was that his own father, the elder Mr. Sterling, personally threw his only son under the bus to save the family empire. In an emergency press conference that afternoon, the board announced Richard's removal from all positions, froze his trust accounts, and insisted he had acted independently, deceiving the leadership. A man who once stood at the peak of power, using money and arrogance to trample the dignity of others, was now stripped of every shell, becoming nothing more than a sacrificial pawn. 2 days after that earth-shattering event, I happened to run into Richard in the silent underground parking garage of the San Francisco Federal Court, where I had just finished the paperwork to drop my countersuit against Sterling Corp., since they were now busy settling tens of millions of dollars on my new company to avoid a public trial. He stood leaning against a concrete pillar, waiting for me. There was no sign of the demigod in a Tom Ford suit wearing expensive perfume. Richard looked wrecked, his beard unshaven, his bloodshot eyes vacant and glazed, his shirt rumpled as if he had worn it for days. When he saw me approach, he rushed out. The hands that once pointed at my face in insult were now clasped together, trembling as they gripped the door of my modest sedan. Ellie, please, just 1 minute." His voice was thin, cracked, and pathetic. "The lawyers say if you write a letter of leniency to the judge saying this was just an internal copyright dispute and not intentional fraud, I won't have to go to prison. My father has cut off all my funds. None of my friends will pick up the phone. I've lost everything, Ellie. Please, tell me how much money you want. I'll sign a promissory note. I'll do anything. I'm sorry for calling you trash. I was wrong," he cried. The tears of a 30-year-old man used to living in silk fell down his pathetic face. A normal person in my position might have felt ultimate satisfaction taking this chance to scream at him, venting all the frustration from months of psychological abuse, or delivering a lecture on karma. But you know, the most brutal punishment for a narcissist is not hatred. Hatred proves you still care, that you are still influenced by them. The ultimate punishment is absolute indifference, their total absence from your mind. I stood still, quietly looking at him with a gaze as flat as a winter lake, without a flicker of emotion, not a hint of pity, and not even a drop of triumph. After he finished his sobbing, I spoke, my voice steady and light. "Richard, do you think I did all of this because I wanted revenge on you? Do you think I stayed up those nights in that warehouse because I hated you?" He looked up at me, bewildered. I shook my head slightly, the corners of my lips pulling to a faint smile, weary but profoundly at peace. "No, I did it because I had to protect my brainchild. Your downfall was just an unintended side effect of me moving forward. To me right now, you aren't an enemy and you aren't a nightmare. You simply do not exist. Don't look for me again because I no longer have time to think about you." I brushed his hand off the car door, stepped inside, started the engine, and drove away without a single glance in the rearview mirror. I left behind the person who was once the demon of my life, now only a hollow shadow screaming hopelessly in the dark basement. The retribution of an enemy may bring temporary satisfaction, but true healing comes from somewhere else. The next morning, as I sat drinking black coffee in my new office that still smelled of fresh paint, the wall-mounted TV was broadcasting live Squawk Box on CNBC, the news the elite treat as scripture. The guest that day was Julian Hayes. The arrogant man who never knew how to bow to anyone sat with his legs crossed in the studio armchair. The host began with a probing question about how he had snatched away a genius. Julian didn't smile. He looked directly into the camera lens, his face stern, angular, and unusually sincere. "I didn't snatch anyone away." Julian's deep, warm voice broke through the artificial atmosphere of the interview. "The truth is I almost personally killed her hope. The night Eleanor Vance brought that algorithm to me, I was blinded by my own prejudices and past wounds. I tore her files apart in the pouring rain and hurled the bitterest words to her that a self-proclaimed elite could utter, simply because she didn't have an Ivy League label or an expensive suit." The studio went silent.
Such a raw confession from a billionaire on national television was unprecedented. But she taught me and this entire arrogant Silicon Valley a costly lesson. Dignity does not lie in a bank account balance, and genius can sprout from the most barren places. Today, on this broadcast, I want to offer my deepest and most public apology to my partner, my co-founder, and the greatest mind I have ever had the honor to work with, Eleanor Vance. The algorithm core is hers, and the future of our corporation lies in her hands. My heart skipped a beat. The tears I had suppressed through so many years of humiliation, so many sleepless nights, and so many times being looked down upon, finally fell. Not because I was weak, but because the 1,000-pound weight of injustice had truly been lifted from my shoulders. A dark chapter filled with prejudice and tears had closed. I looked out the transparent glass window where the California sky, a cloudless deep blue, stretched infinitely. There were no more limits. Now there was only freedom.
Do you know the strangest thing about time? It has the power to heal all wounds, but it also has a way of completely reshaping our definition of success. Exactly 1 year after the Genesis system collapsed at the Moscone Center and dragged the Sterling Empire into the mud, I am standing on a podium again. But this time, there are no blinding LED lights, no billionaires in designer suits sipping expensive champagne, and no live Wall Street cameras. I am standing in a worn-out gymnasium smelling of floor wax and the sour sweat of South Chicago Community College, my alma mater. Around me are stained brick walls and faded sports banners, and below the stands are 300 students staring at me. They wear frayed hoodies and carry heavy backpacks, their eyes sunken from working late-night shifts at fast food joints or gas stations just to pay tomorrow's tuition. Looking down at them, I see myself 10 years ago, those haunted by imposter syndrome, constantly wondering if they deserve to breathe the same air as the elite out there. I take a deep breath, adjust the cheap, crackling microphone, and smile. 1 year ago, I begin, my voice echoing through the cramped space. I was unemployed, homeless, burdened with a mountain of student debt, and thrown out into a downpour at the age of 25. People told me that a girl raised in the slums, living paycheck to paycheck, graduating from a school that even Google wouldn't put on its screening list, had no right to change the world. I pause, watching the faces shift from curiosity to profound empathy. Sitting in the very front row are not venture capitalists, but Uncle Dave, the former Sterling Corp IT guy who is now the head of cybersecurity at my new company, and Auntie Loretta, the owner of that humble diner, today wearing her brightest floral dress and dabbing tears with a crumpled tissue. They are the true angel investors of my life. In this America, people love to preach about the American dream, that as long as you work hard, you will succeed. But the truth is, the world out there is designed to spit on your dreams if you don't share a zip code with them. I swallow hard, my heart beats steady. They will steal your brain power. They will use six-figure checks to buy your self-respect. And when you resist, they will use power to slander you into nothingness. But you know what? There is one thing no billionaire, no power can strip from you: the dignity that lies deep within your brain. I look toward the back of the gym, where dull aluminum chairs are stacked. There, leaning against the brick wall near the exit, is Julian Hayes. He isn't wearing an expensive overcoat or polished Italian leather shoes. My co-founder is wearing a simple gray t-shirt, holding a cup of terrible paper cup coffee from the school canteen, watching me with a warm, proud, and understanding smile. He has completely shed the arrogant armor of the elite to step into my world, becoming my most steadfast partner, and perhaps a companion for the next chapters of my life. Our eyes meet, and a gentle nod without words is enough to convey 1,000 things. I turn back to the audience, pouring all my energy into my final words, my voice sharper and more determined than ever. Never let anyone use your background as a yardstick for your limits. They can tear up your resume in the freezing rain. They can strip your reputation in the news, but they can never hack your resilience.
This sky has no limits unless you allow others to place a glass ceiling over your head. Go out there, write your own code, build your own empires, and remember, the sharpest weapon of those at the bottom of society is never giving up. The entire gymnasium erupts. 300 students bolt to their feet, their applause and cheers shaking the dust-covered windows. This isn't the polished socialite applause of Silicon Valley. It's the roar of the vulnerable who have just found the light, the thunder of a new generation ready to shatter every prejudice to rise. I stand there on the simple wooden podium, looking at the radiant faces filled with tears and smiles, feeling an absolute peace flowing through my chest. The dirty war of the arrogant has faded behind me, giving way to an infinite sky of freedom. Eleanor Vance's story doesn't end with revenge. It opens with rebirth. The rebirth of a soul once shattered, now piecing itself together to become one of the brightest lighthouses in America. The sky out there is still a deep blue, and for the first time in my life, I know I have truly taken flight. As we close the story of Eleanor Vance, we realize that this isn't just a hidden corner of Silicon Valley, but a true portrait of human value amidst countless prejudices. Life sometimes throws us into the mud, and society often hurries to judge a person by the clothes they wear, their university degree, or their background. But as the American saying goes, the cream always rises to the top. Your true value is never dimmed by the judgment of others. True gold does not fear the fire. The most profound lesson here is the power of self-respect and the courage to walk away from toxic relationships. Never let narcissists or insults define who you are. Maintaining your integrity and composure is sometimes the sharpest weapon, because what goes around comes around. Truth and justice may arrive late, but they will certainly catch up with the arrogant. No matter your age, remember that dignity is the only asset no one can take from you, unless you hand it to them yourself. Thank you to all the kindred spirits who stayed and listened with LifeLore until these final minutes. What are your thoughts on Eleanor's resilience and the price Richard had to pay? Have you or anyone around you ever struggled to overcome a deep-seated prejudice? Please share your story in the comments below, because your experience might just be the light for someone currently lost. Don't forget to like and subscribe to LifeLore so we can continue to accompany you in the next emotional and humanistic stories. Wishing you a peaceful day. May you always find the tranquility, hope, and the brightest light that belongs to you after all the storms and chaos of life.